Have you ever stood on a cliff, the wind whipping through your hair, and stared out at the vast, seemingly endless ocean? Have you ever wondered what lies beyond that horizon? For a small island nation in the late 16th century, that question wasn't just a fleeting thought. It was a powerful, driving obsession. This is the story of how England, a country on the edge of Europe, dared to dream a dream across the ocean. Imagine England at this time. It's a nation buzzing with a new kind of energy. The Renaissance has sparked a thirst for knowledge, for art, and for discovery. But it's also a nation feeling a little bit small. To the south, the mighty Spanish Empire, fat with gold and silver from the New World, casts a long shadow. Their galleons, like floating fortresses, rule the waves, bringing back unimaginable treasures from lands England could only hear about in hushed, envious whispers. For an ambitious English monarch like Queen Elizabeth I, and for her people, this was simply unacceptable. They saw Spain's wealth and power and thought, why not us? It was a bold, almost audacious question. England was not yet a naval superpower. Its ships were smaller, its sailors hardy but less experienced in long-haul voyages than their Spanish and Portuguese rivals. But what they lacked in experience, they more than made up for in ambition. This wasn't just about envy. It was about survival, about securing England's future in a rapidly changing world. The dream began not in the royal court, but in the bustling, noisy ports of London, Bristol, and Plymouth. It lived in the conversations of merchants in crowded taverns, their talk filled with exotic names like Cathay and the Indies. They dreamed of cutting out the middlemen of Venetian and Genoese traders who controlled the overland spiced routes and sailing directly to the source of pepper, cloves, and silk, commodities worth more than their weight in gold. These merchants were the venture capitalists of their day. They pooled their money, forming joint stock companies, to fund daring, high-risk expeditions. A single successful voyage could make them all fabulously wealthy. A failed one could ruin them, but the potential reward was so great that they were willing to roll the dice. They commissioned ships, hired captains, and pored over crude, often inaccurate maps, trying to chart a new path to paradise. And then there were the explorers, the men who would actually sail these ships into the unknown. These weren't just sailors, they were adventurers, a unique breed of men driven by a potent mix of patriotism, piety, and personal ambition. Men like Sir Francis Drake, part pirate, part patriot, who saw Spanish ships not as obstacles, but as opportunities. His circumnavigation of the globe wasn't just a stunning feat of navigation. It was a direct challenge to Spain's dominance, and the treasure he brought back filled the Queen's coffers and the nation's heart with pride. There was Sir Walter Raleigh, the dashing courtier and poet, who dreamed not just of gold, but of planting a New England in the soil of North America. He envisioned colonies, permanent settlements where English families could build new lives, flying the flag of St. George thousands of miles from home. His attempts at Roanoke, the famous lost colony, ended in mystery and failure. But the idea he planted took root in the English imagination. And let's not forget the quieter, more scholarly dreamers, like Richard Hack. He never sailed on a great voyage himself, but his contribution was just as crucial. He was a geographer and a writer, a propagandist for empire. He tirelessly collected sailors, tailies, explorers, journals, and merchants' reports. He compiled them into massive books that were, essentially, adventure stories, travel guides, and investment prospectuses, all rolled into one. His writings painted a picture of a world ripe for the taking, filled with riches and opportunity, just waiting for bold Englishmen to claim it. He argued passionately that colonization was not just profitable, but a moral duty, a way to spread English law, liberty, and religion to the unenlightened corners of the earth. So, what was this dream across the ocean? It was a complex tapestry woven from many different threads. It was the merchant's desire for profit, the explorer's thirst for glory, the Queen's strategic need for power, and the nation's burgeoning sense of destiny. It was a belief that England's future lay not in Europe, but across the great, mysterious Atlantic. This dream was fueled by stories, tales of mythical cities of gold, like El Dorado, reports from sailors who claimed to have seen lands of incredible fertility, with rivers full of fish and forests teeming with game. These stories, a mix of fact and fantasy, spread like wildfire, capturing the public's imagination. Every young boy playing by the docks could dream of being the next Drake, of finding his fortune in a land where anything seemed possible. Of course, the reality was far harsher. The ocean was a terrifying and unforgiving place. Storms could splinter a ship in minutes. Disease could sweep through a crew, leaving a vessel a floating coffin. Starvation was a constant threat, and for those who did make it to new lands, they often found not welcoming shores, but unfamiliar dangers and people who were not always happy to see them. But the dream was stronger than the fear. It was a forward-looking vision, a collective gamble on the future. England was placing a bet, and the stake was its identity as a nation. Would it remain a small, peripheral island, or would it transform itself into a global power? The answer lay somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, in the vast, beckoning, and dangerous expanse of the ocean. As the 16th century drew to a close, all the pieces were in place. The ambition had been sparked, the funds had been raised, the ships were being built, and the men were ready to sail. The first chapter of a new story was about to be written, a story of struggle, triumph, and tragedy. A story that would change not only England, but the entire world. The dream was about to become a reality. Thank you so much for joining me on this first leg of our journey. If you found this fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter, where we'll see these dreams put to the test in the harsh reality of the new world. See you next time. Have you ever wondered what it takes to start a new country? It's not just about planting a flag. It's about money, power, and a whole lot of ambition. That's exactly what was brewing in London in the early 1600s. And it all centered around one powerful group, the Virginia Company of London. Let's set the scene. England, at the turn of the 17th century, was buzzing. Queen Elizabeth I had passed away, and the new king, James I, was on the throne. England was looking across the Atlantic, watching its rival, Spain, get fantastically wealthy from gold and silver mines in South and Central America. English sailors, like the famous Sir Francis Drake, had been raiding Spanish ships for years, but that wasn't a sustainable national strategy. England wanted a piece of the American pie for itself. They wanted their own source of wealth, a way to expand their influence, and a new place to send their growing population. But how do you fund such a massive, risky venture? Colonizing a new land thousands of miles away was incredibly expensive. You needed ships, supplies, food, weapons, and people willing to risk everything. The king wasn't going to foot the entire bill himself. This is where the genius of the joint stock company comes in. Think of it like a 17th century version of a modern corporation or even a crowdfunding campaign. The Virginia Company of London was exactly that. A group of wealthy merchants, politicians, and adventurers who pooled their money together. They weren't philanthropists. They were capitalists. They were betting that they could establish a colony in North America that would make them rich. What were they hoping to find? Well, they had a few ideas. The number one hope was, of course, gold. They'd heard the Spanish stories and were convinced that North America must be hiding similar treasures. If not gold, then maybe silver, or a new, quick passage to Asia for the spice trade. They also thought about other resources like timber for shipbuilding, tar, pitch, and maybe even exotic crops that could be grown and sold back in Europe. The goal was simple: turn a profit for the shareholders. To make this all official, they needed the king's permission. In 1606, King James I granted the Virginia Company a royal charter. This charter was a crucial document. It was like a permission slip and a business license all rolled into one. It gave the company the legal right to establish a colony in a huge stretch of land on the North American coast, which they named Virginia in honor of the late Virgin Queen, Elizabeth I. The charter did a few important things. First, it defined the territory. It granted the company the land from roughly modern-day North Carolina up to New York. Second, it outlined the company's rights to govern the colony, to defend it, and, most importantly, to search for and profit from any resources they found. Third, and this is a point that becomes incredibly important later, the charter declared that the colonists who went to Virginia, and their children would have all the same liberties, franchises, and immunities as if they had been born and were living in England. This meant they were still considered English subjects with English rights. This single clause would become a rallying cry for American revolutionaries over 150 years later. So, the company had the money from its investors and the legal backing from the king. Their plan was bold and ambitious. They would recruit settlers, pack them onto 3 small ships, and send them across the treacherous Atlantic Ocean. These weren't necessarily seasoned pioneers. The first group included many gentlemen, men from wealthy families who were unaccustomed to hard labor along with artisans, craftsmen, and common laborers. Their instructions were clear. Find a suitable location for a settlement, preferably a river that might lead to the Pacific. Establish a fortified post. Be friendly with the native people if possible, but be prepared for conflict. And above all, start searching for gold and other valuable commodities immediately to give the investors a quick return. In December of 1606, 3 ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery set sail from London. On board were 104 men and boys, a sealed box containing the names of the colony's first leaders and the hopes and dreams of the Virginia Company. They had no idea of the immense hardships that awaited them. The harsh environment, the unfamiliar diseases, the starvation, and the complex relationship that would form with the powerful Powhatan Confederacy that already called this land home. The Virginia Company's plan was a business venture, a gamble on a massive scale. They were driven by the desire for wealth and national prestige, while their initial hopes for gold would be dashed. Their bold plan would ultimately lay the foundation for the first permanent English colony in North America. It was the first, uncertain step that would eventually lead to the creation of the United States of America. Thanks for watching. If you found this dive into the Virginia Company interesting, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more chapters in our American history series. We'll see you in the next video. Hello and welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we're diving into Chapter 3. Setting sail, where 3 small ships embark on a monumental voyage that will change the course of history forever. Imagine the scene. It's late 1606, and the docks of London are buzzing with a nervous energy. The air is cold, thick with the smell of tar, salt, and anticipation. This is the starting point for one of the most daring ventures of the 17th century, the founding of Jamestown. Our story begins with the Virginia Company of London, a group of ambitious investors who had received a royal charter from King James I. Their goal was simple on paper, but incredibly complex in reality. Establish a permanent English colony in North America. They weren't just looking for a new place to live. They were seeking wealth, power, and a foothold for the British Empire in the so-called New World. The dream was of gold, silver, and a profitable trade route to the east. But the path to that dream was fraught with peril, a treacherous journey across the vast and unpredictable Atlantic Ocean. The vessels chosen for this epic undertaking were not grand warships, but relatively small, workaday, merchant ships. The flagship was the Susan Constant, the largest of the 3 at about 120 tons. Think of it as the command center of the fleet. Captained by the experienced mariner Christopher Newport, a one-armed privateer who had spent years raiding Spanish treasure fleets. The Susan Constant carried the most prominent gentlemen and the bulk of the provisions. It was a stout, 3-masted ship, built for hauling cargo, not for comfort. Life aboard would have been cramped, dark, and constantly damp. Next in line was the Godspeed, a vessel of about 40 tons. It was smaller, nimbler, and captained by Bartholomew Gosnold, a key figure in organizing the entire expedition. Gosnold was an experienced explorer who had already sailed to the coast of New England a few years prior. He was a driving force behind the Virginia Company and was deeply invested, both financially and emotionally, in the colony's success. The Godspeed carried a mix of gentlemen, adventurers, and skilled laborers, all essential for the survival of the new settlement. Finally, there was the Discovery, the smallest of the fleet, a tiny pinnace of just 20 tons. It was captained by John Ratcliffe. The Discovery was essentially a support vessel, designed for exploring shallow coastal waters and rivers once they reached Virginia. Imagine a small boat that could navigate where the larger ships couldn't, scouting for safe harbors and suitable settlement locations. Its size made it agile, but also incredibly vulnerable to the open ocean's fury. Life on the Discovery would have been the most challenging of all, with its passengers and crew exposed to the elements in a way that is hard for us to comprehend today. Packed onto these 3 ships were 104 men and boys. No women were on this initial voyage. That would come later. This first group was a motley crew. They were well-to-do gentlemen, many of whom were the younger sons of aristocrats, with no inheritance prospects back home. They were seeking fortune and adventure, but most had never done a day of hard labor in their lives. Alongside them were the craftsmen and laborious carpenters, blacksmiths, bricklayers, a tailor, a barber, and a surgeon. These were the men whose practical skills would be crucial for building a new society from scratch. And, of course, there were the sailors, the seasoned hands, who knew the unforgiving nature of the sea. On a cold winter's day, December 20th, 1606, the 3 ships finally weighed anchor and slipped out of Blackwall on the River Thames. The mood must have been a mix of excitement and profound anxiety. Families waved goodbye from the shore, many seeing their loved ones for the last time. For the settlers, this was a one-way ticket to an unknown destiny. They were leaving behind everything they knew, their homes, their culture, the familiar sights and sounds of England for a wilderness, rumored to be filled with both untold riches and unimaginable dangers. The journey did not start well. Instead of heading straight out into the Atlantic, contrary winds and storms trapped the small fleet in the English Channel for 6 long, frustrating weeks. Imagine being cooped up in those dark, smelly, and crowded conditions, rocking violently in the winter seas, before your real journey had even begun. Food and water supplies, meant to last for months, were already being consumed. Tempers flared, and seasickness was rampant. The initial excitement likely soured into doubt and misery. The gentlemen, unaccustomed to such hardship, began to clash with the common sailors. Tensions that would later plague the colony were already beginning to simmer below decks. Finally, in February 1607, the winds changed. The Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery broke free from the English coast and pointed their bows toward the vast, open ocean. They took the traditional southern route, a longer but safer path that used predictable trade winds. They sailed south, past the coast of Europe, towards the Canary Islands, off the coast of Africa. Here, they could restock on fresh water, wine, and food before tackling the most daunting leg of the journey, the transatlantic crossing itself. This stop was a brief respite, a moment of solid ground under their feet before they plunged into the great unknown. From the Canaries, they set a course due west, catching the trade winds that would push them across the Atlantic. For weeks on end, the men would see nothing but an endless expanse of water. Day after day, the sun would rise, travel across the sky, and set, with only the creak of the ship's timbers, the snap of the sails, and the constant rush of the waves as a soundtrack. Life aboard was a monotonous and grueling routine. The space was incredibly tight. The men slept in shifts, crammed into any available space, often on the hard wooden decks. The diet was grim, consisting mainly of salted beef or pork, dried fish, and hardtack, a rock-hard biscuit that was often infested with weevils. The drinking water, stored in wooden casks, quickly became slimy and foul-tasting. Scurvy and other diseases caused by malnutrition and poor sanitation were a constant threat. There was no privacy, no comfort, and no escape from the close quarters and the tensions brewing among the passengers. Think about the psychological toll. These men were cut off from the entire known world. If a storm hit, they were at the mercy of the ocean's power. If disease broke out, there was nowhere to run. They had to place their faith in their captains, their ships, and their shared mission. But that faith was constantly tested. Records from the voyage, particularly from a young gentleman named George Percy, detail the arguments and power struggles that erupted. Captain John Smith, a commoner but an experienced soldier and adventurer, was particularly divisive. His brash confidence and undisguised contempt for the inept gentleman led to him being arrested and confined for mutiny during the voyage. He spent much of the trip in chains, a dramatic foreshadowing of the conflicts that would define Jamestown's early years. After more than 2 months at sea, the sight of land would have been a near miraculous event. They had crossed the vast ocean. But their journey wasn't over. They first landed in the Caribbean, stopping at several islands, including Martinique and Guadeloupe. Here, the lush, tropical environment was a world away from the cold, grey England they had left behind. They encountered native peoples, marveled at exotic plants and animals, and, most importantly, replenished their dwindling supplies of fresh water and food. But this tropical paradise also held new dangers, including unfamiliar illnesses and tense encounters. Finally, after this island-hopping interlude, they turned north, sailing up the coast of America. On April 26, 1607, after a grueling 4-month journey, they spotted land. They had reached the coast of Virginia. The men were overcome with relief and joy. They named their initial landing point Cape Henry, in honor of the Prince of Wales. George Percy wrote, "We were all ravished at the sight thereof." They had made it. They had survived the Atlantic. They had arrived in the New World. But as they took their first steps onto the sandy shores of this new continent, they had no idea of the immense challenges that lay ahead. The vast, dense wilderness was not empty. It was the homeland of the powerful Powhatan Confederacy. The search for gold would prove fruitless, and the struggle for simple survival would become their all-consuming reality. The 3 small ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery had successfully delivered their human cargo to a new world. But the story of Jamestown, a story of hardship, conflict, and sheer perseverance, was only just beginning. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter of our story. The voyage was an incredible feat of endurance, and it set the stage for everything that was to come. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. And do you not forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode, where we explore the founding of the settlement and the colonists' first encounters with the native peoples of Virginia. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. The world as we knew it shrank to the dimensions of our ship, a tiny, defiant speck on an endless, churning canvas of gray. We had traded familiar fields and skies for the creaking timbers of our new, temporary home, a vessel that groaned with the weight of our collective hopes and fears. Below deck, the air was thick, a heavy blanket woven from the smells of tar, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present dampness of the sea. Space was a luxury none of us could afford. We were packed in like cargo, families huddled together in cramped, dimly lit quarters. Our belongings piled around us, a constant reminder of the lives we had left behind. Days bled into nights, the rhythm of our existence dictated by the rise and fall of the waves. At first, there was a novelty to it, the gentle rocking of the ship a lullaby, but the Atlantic is no gentle mother. Soon, the ocean's mood soured, and the rocking turned into a violent, relentless tossing. Seasickness became our unwelcome companion, a green-faced monster that spared no one. The bravest among us, men who had faced down hardships on land, were reduced to weak, groaning figures, clutching their stomachs as the world tilted and spun around them. It was a humbling, shared misery that stripped away all pretense, leaving only our raw humanity. Food became a monotonous affair. Hardtack biscuits, so tough you could break a tooth on them, and salted meat that seemed to draw every last drop of moisture from your body. Fresh water was rationed, each sip a precious treasure. We'd stare out at the infinite expanse of salt water, a cruel irony that we were surrounded by water yet perpetually thirsty. Illnesses spread quickly in the close quarters. A cough in one corner could become a chorus by morning. We learned to care for one another, sharing what little medicine we had, offering a cool cloth for a fevered brow, or simply a hand to hold in the darkness. Then came the storms. They were not just storms. They were apocalyptic rages of nature. The sky would turn a bruised, menacing purple-black, and the sea would rise up in mountainous waves that threatened to swallow us whole. The ship would scream under the strain, its timbers groaning like a beast in agony. We'd hear the frantic shouts of the sailors on deck, the snap of ropes, and the deafening roar of the wind. Below, we would be thrown from side to side, clutching onto anything bolted down. our prayers a desperate whisper against the thunderous symphony of the tempest. In those moments, it felt like the world was ending, that this watery abyss would be our final resting place. We huddled together, the boundaries between families blurring until we were just one terrified, trembling mass, united in our plea for survival. Yet, even in the darkest, most terrifying hours, something incredible flickered to life. Hope. It was a stubborn, resilient flame that refused to be extinguished. It was in the stories whispered in the dark, tales of the new world, of land that stretched as far as the eye could see, of opportunities to build a life free from the hardships we had fled. It was in the shared glance between a husband and wife, a silent promise that they would get through this together. It was in the laughter of children who, with their incredible capacity for joy, could find a game in the sway of a lantern or the scurrying of a ship's rat. They were our living, breathing reminders of why we were enduring this hell. We were not just running from something. We were sailing towards something. After a particularly vicious storm, the sky finally broke. A sliver of sunlight pierced the clouds, painting a golden streak across the water. Someone on deck shouted, a cry that was picked up and echoed throughout the ship. Land. Land ho! We scrambled, crawling over each other to get a glimpse, and there it was, a faint, dark line on the horizon. It was more than just land. It was a promise fulfilled. It was the end of the storm and the beginning of everything. Tears streamed down our faces, tears of relief, of exhaustion, of overwhelming, heart-stopping joy. We had crossed the abyss. We had weathered the tempest. We had survived. The salt on our lips tasted not of the bitter sea, but of a new beginning. The journey had been a crucible, forging us, testing us, and ultimately binding us together. We were no longer just a collection of strangers on a ship. We were a community, ready to set foot on new ground and build our future. Thank you so much for joining me on this leg of the journey. It's a story of incredible hardship, but also of unbelievable resilience. If you found this chapter as moving as I did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world and helps me continue to bring these stories to life. We'll see you in the next chapter as we finally step onto the shores of the new world. Hello history buffs, and welcome back to our series on the founding of America. Today, we are rediving into a pivotal moment. The arrival of the first English settlers at the Chesapeake Bay. Imagine you've spent nearly 5 months at sea, tossed about on the relentless Atlantic Ocean. Your world has been nothing but creaking wood, salty air, and the endless, monotonous grablue of the water. Food is running low, water is stale, and the hope that fueled your departure is starting to fray. This was the reality for the 104 men and boys aboard 3 small ships there. Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery-S. They sailed towards a future they could only dream of. They had left London in December 1606, braving winter storms and the vast unknown, all sponsored by the Virginia Company with dreams of gold, a passage to the east, and a foothold for England in the New World. The journey was grueling. Confined spaces bred tension, sickness was a constant companion, and the psychological toll of being adrift for so long was immense. They were sailors, gentlemen, craftsmen, and laborers, all gambling their lives on a promise. Then, on a late April day in 1607, everything changed. A cry from the crow's nest. Land ho! After 144 days at sea, the sight that greeted them was almost beyond belief. It wasn't just land, it was a vision of paradise. Emerging from the mists of the Atlantic was a coastline teeming with life, a vibrant green that seemed to pulse with energy. This was Cape Henry, at the mouth of the mighty Chesapeake Bay. The date was April 26th, 1607. As the ships drew closer, the sheer scale and wildness of the landscape must have been breathtaking. Towering forests, denser and taller than anything they had seen in the manicured landscapes of England, stretched as far as the eye could see. The air, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, would have been a shock to lungs accustomed to the stale air of the ship's hold. It was the smell of a new beginning. They saw fair meadows and goodly tall trees. As one of the settlers, George Percy, would later write, the promise of this fresh, untamed land was palpable. Stepping ashore for the first time, the settlers felt the solid ground beneath their feet a profound relief after months of swaying on the ocean. The sensation of soft sand and rich soil was a welcome anchor to reality. They were standing on the edge of a continent that was both magnificent and intimidating. The sheer abundance was overwhelming. The waters of the Chesapeake Bay, one of the world's largest estuaries, were teeming with fish and shellfish. Oysters, they would soon discover, were so plentiful they lay in massive beds, some reportedly as large as a dinner plate. The rivers that fed into the bay, which they would name the James, the York, and the Rappahannock, flowed wide and deep, carving paths into the mysterious interior. These waterways were not just geographical features. They were potential highways to wealth, arteries that could lead them to the rumored riches of the continent. The settlers marveled at the streams of fresh water and the goodliest woods, including cypress, cedar, and towering oaks. The forest canopy was alive with the calls of birds they had never heard before, a constant symphony of the wild. This initial encounter was filled with a sense of wonder and optimism. The land was beautiful, fertile, and seemingly empty, waiting to be claimed. In his writings, Percy described the landscape in glowing terms, noting the abundance of vines and bigness of a man's thigh running up to the tops of the trees. Strawberries were 4 times bigger and better than those in England. It seemed as though they had found a new Eden, a land of milk and honey that would surely reward their perilous journey. This was the dream the Virginia Company had sold them, and for a fleeting moment, it appeared to be true. But this paradise was not uninhabited. As they explored the immediate area, they had their first encounter with the native inhabitants, the Powhatan people. This initial meeting was not a peaceful exchange of pleasantries. It was a sudden, violent clash. As a small party explored the shore, they were ambushed. Arrows flew from the woods, injuring 2 of the Englishmen. This brief, sharp conflict was a stark and immediate reminder that they were not entering an empty wilderness. They were intruders in a land that had been home to a complex society for centuries. This first hostile encounter was a dark omen, a foreshadowing of the immense challenges and conflicts that lay ahead. The dream of a peaceful settlement was instantly complicated by the reality of a populated and defended territory. Despite this ominous start, the mission had to continue. Their instructions from the Virginia Company were clear: find a secure, defensible location to build a settlement, preferably on a major river, far enough inland to be safe from Spanish patrols, but accessible for their own ships. So, after planting across at Cape Henry and claiming the land for King James I, they reboarded their ships and began to explore the vast Chesapeake Bay. They were searching for the perfect spot to build their new home, a place that would become the first permanent English settlement in North America. For the next 2.5 weeks, they sailed up the wide river they named the James, in honor of their king. They were looking for a site that met all their strategic requirements. They needed deep water anchorage for their ships, a location that was easily defensible, and a place that was not heavily occupied by native tribes. The landscape continued to impress them with its beauty and apparent bounty. Each bend in the river revealed more of this lush, green world, but with every mile they traveled inland, they moved deeper into the heart of the powerful Powhatan Confederacy, a sophisticated network of Algonquian-speaking tribes, led by the paramount chief, Wahunsenata, whom the English would simply call Powhatan. Finally, on May 13, 1607, they chose a site. It was a small, marshy peninsula about 40 miles up the James River. From a military perspective, it seemed ideal. It was surrounded by water on 3 sides, making it easy to defend, and the river was deep enough for their ships to moor right against the shore. It was also, crucially, not the site of a major native village. They believed this would minimize conflict. They named their new settlement Jamestown, in honor of their king, and the great adventure of building a New England in the Virginia soil began. The initial optimism of their landfall at the Chesapeake was a powerful, driving force. The settlers saw a land of incredible potential, a place where they could build new lives and fortunes. But that first glimpse of paradise was deceptive. The beauty of the land masked the immense dangers that lurked within it. The unfamiliar diseases of the swampy terrain, the harsh realities of surviving in a wilderness, and the complex and often hostile relationship they would have with the Powhatan people. Their journey had ended, but their struggle for survival had just begun. The story of Jamestown would not be a simple tale of conquest, but a desperate fight for life against overwhelming odds. Thank you so much for joining us on this leg of the journey. The story of what happened next in Jamestown is one of hardship, starvation, and incredible resilience. If you enjoyed this video and want to find out how these settlers fared, please make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. We love hearing from you, so leave a comment below with your thoughts. Until next time, stay curious. Welcome back to our journey through early American history. Today, we're diving into Chapter 6, Choosing a Home, and it's a real heads. Picture this. You've just sailed across the Atlantic for months. You finally land in a new, vast continent full of possibilities. And where do you decide to settle? A swamp. Yes, a swampy, mosquito-infested, muggy piece of land that would become known as Jamestown Island. So, why on earth did the English colonists pick this spot? It seems completely counterintuitive, right? The land was low, marshy, and terrible for farming. The water was brackish, a mix of fresh and salt water, which wasn't great for drinking, and the mosquitoes. Oh, the mosquitoes were relentless, carrying diseases like malaria that would prove devastating. It sounds like a recipe for disaster from day one. But to understand their decision, we have to get inside their heads and think about their number one fear. It wasn't starvation, at least not at first. It wasn't disease, which they didn't fully understand yet. Their biggest, most immediate threat was Spain. Let's set the stage. By 1607, Spain was the world's superpower. They had a massive empire in the Americas, stretching from modern-day Chile all the way up to the American Southwest. They were rich, powerful, and fiercely protective of their claims in the New World. The English, on the other hand, were the underdogs. They were late to the colonization game, and this Virginia venture was a risky, privately funded gamble. The Spanish had already crushed a French attempt to settle in Florida just a few decades earlier. The English knew that if the Spanish found their fledgling colony, they would not hesitate to wipe it off the map. So, the colonists' primary instruction from the Virginia Company in London was crystal clear. Build your settlement in a place that is easily defended, especially from ships. When the three small English ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery sailed into the Chesapeake Bay, they were in enemy territory. They explored the coastline, looking for the perfect location. They needed a spot that was hidden from the open ocean, yet provided deep water anchorage for their own ships. As they sailed up the wide river, they named the James. In honor of their king, they found a peninsula that seemed to fit the bill. It was located about 30 miles inland from the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. This was a crucial detail. It meant that Spanish patrol ships sailing along the Atlantic coast wouldn't just stumble upon them. An enemy fleet would have to deliberately sail deep into the bay and then navigate up the river, giving the colonists valuable time to prepare a defense, or even spot them coming. The site also had another key defensive advantage. The water right up against the shore was incredibly deep. This allowed the colonists to moor their ships right against the land, almost like parking a car next to a curb. This was huge. It meant they could easily load and unload supplies, but more importantly, they could use the cannons on their own ships as a floating fortress. If they were attacked by land, they could turn the ship's cannons to face the shore. It effectively made their ships part of the settlement's defensive walls. So, from a purely military perspective, Jamestown Island was a brilliant choice. It was a hidden, defensible fort. The colonists immediately set to work building a triangular palisade, a wooden wall with raised platforms for cannons at each corner. They were preparing for a Spanish attack that they felt was inevitable. Unfortunately, what made the site so good for defense made it absolutely terrible for survival. The same swampy terrain that made it difficult for an army to attack also made it impossible to grow enough food. The colonists were gentlemen, soldiers, and adventurers, not farmers. They expected to trade with the local Powhatan people for food and to be resupplied from England. They were unprepared for the backbreaking work of clearing land and planting crops in the unforgiving Virginia soil. The brackish water from the James River was another silent killer. During the summer, when the river flow was low, salty ocean water pushed further upstream. The colonists were essentially drinking contaminated water, leading to salt, poisoning, typhoid, and dysentery. This, combined with the malaria from the mosquitoes, created a lethal environment. The Powhatan Confederacy, led by the powerful chief Wahunsunaka, also viewed this location with suspicion. While it wasn't a major village site for them, likely because they, too, knew it was a poor place to live, it was still part of their territory. The colonists' focus on building a fort instead of planting fields sent a clear, aggressive message. So, we have this incredible paradox, the very decision that was meant to protect the colony from its greatest external threat. Spanish ended up creating the perfect storm of internal threats: disease, starvation, and contaminated water. The colonists were so focused on the enemy they could see on the horizon that they were blindsided by the invisible enemies, all around them in the water they drank and the air they breathed. This choice of location set the stage for the starving time and the immense suffering that would define Jamestown's early years. It's a powerful lesson in priorities. In their desperate bid for security, they sacrificed sustainability. They chose a fort over a farm, and they paid a heavy price for it. It was a strategic decision that nearly cost them everything, and it is a critical piece of the puzzle in understanding why the Jamestown settlement teetered so dangerously on the brink of collapse. In hindsight, it's easy to criticize their choice. Why not settle on one of the more fertile, healthier spots they surely passed on their way up the river? But through their eyes, the fear of the Spanish Armada appearing over the horizon was real and immediate. They were playing a high-stakes game of survival, and they made a calculated gamble, prioritizing military defense above all else. That gamble, as we'll see, would have profound and tragic consequences. Thanks so much for watching. Join us next time as we explore the difficult first years of the Jamestown settlement and their interactions with the If you're enjoying this series, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss an episode. We'll see you in the next chapter. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey into the past. Today, we're diving deep into Chapter 7, Building a Fort in the Wilderness. Imagine this. You've arrived in a vast, untamed land. The air is fresh, the forests are dense, but you're also exposed. What's the first thing you need? Protection. Protection. And that is exactly what we were talking about today. Tea and hard work that went into constructing a life-saving wilderness fort. So, how did they do it? Let's break it down. The most common and effective design was the triangular fort. Why a triangle? It's a surprisingly strong geometric shape that offers excellent defensive advantages. With 3 corners, you can create overlapping fields of fire, meaning there are no blind spots for an attacker to hide. It's a brilliant piece of practical engineering, using simple geometry for maximum security. The first step, and it was a massive one, was gathering the materials. This meant felling dozens, sometimes hundreds, of tall, straight trees. Think about the sheer physical labor involved. Axe swinging from dawn till dusk, the constant ring of steel on wood echoing through the forest. These logs had to be sturdy enough to stop whatever might come their way. They weren't just building a fence, they were building a fortress wall. Once the logs were prepared, the construction of the palisade walls would begin. These weren't just logs placed. The settlers would dig a deep trench along the triangular perimeter of their chosen site. Then, one by one, they would heave these massive, sharpened logs upright into the trench, packing them tightly together. The earth was then tamped back down firmly around the base, creating an imposing, solid barrier that could be anywhere from 10 to 20 feet high. It was a formidable task, requiring the entire community to work together, a true testament to their shared will to survive. But a wall alone isn't enough. You need to be able to see what's coming. This is where the watchtowers come in. At each of the 3 corners of the triangle, they would construct a blockhouse or a watchtower. These were often 2-story structures, built even more robustly than the walls. The lower level provided a secure firing position, with small loopholes or firing slits carved into the wood. These were just big enough to poke a rifle through, but too small for an attacker to easily exploit. The upper level of the watchtower projected out over the main wall. Tisobarang, known as a jetty, was a clever defensive feature. It allowed the defenders to look directly down and fire upon anyone trying to scale or burn the wall below. It eliminated the most vulnerable spot at the base of the palisade. From these elevated positions, sentries could keep a vigilant eye on the surrounding landscape, providing an early warning of any approaching danger. Now, a fort isn't just a military structure. It's a home. It's the heart of the new settlement. Inside these protective walls, life had to go on. So, the settlers would construct small, simple houses. These were typically one-room log cabins, built with the same techniques as the walls, but on a smaller scale. They would use mud, moss, or clay to chink the gaps between the logs, keeping the wind and rain out. A simple stone fireplace provided warmth for cooking and surviving the cold nights. These cabins were arranged within the triangular compound, creating a small, self-contained village. There would also be a central open area, the courtyard, which served as a communal space for various activities, from drilling and training to community gatherings. A secure water source, like a well-dug right in the middle of the fort, was absolutely essential. Without access to fresh water, no settlement could survive a prolonged siege. So, digging that well was one of the highest priorities, often completed even before all the cabins were finished. The gate was the fort's single point of entry and its most vulnerable spot. Therefore, it was heavily reinforced. It was usually a thick, double-layered wooden door, braced with iron straps and secured from the inside with a massive wooden bar. The gate was always guarded, and its opening and closing were strictly controlled. It was the lifeline to the outside world, but also the potential weak point that had to be defended at all costs. Life inside the fort was a blend of routine and constant vigilance. People farmed the cleared land outside the walls during the day, but they would retreat back into the safety of the palisade at night or at the first sign of trouble. Every able-bodied person had a role in the defense of the fort. It was a community bound together by necessity, where every individual's survival depended on the strength of the group and the sturdiness of the wooden walls they had built with their own hands. So when you picture these early settlements, don't just see a simple fence, see the strategic genius of the triangular design. See the back-breaking labor of felling trees and raising the palisade. See the clever architecture of the overhanging watchtowers and the life-sustaining hub of cabins and the well within. This wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of resilience, of community, and of the unyielding human spirit to carve out a home and a future in a challenging new world. It was the cornerstone upon which everything else would be built. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into wilderness fort construction. I hope it gave you a new appreciation for the skill and determination of these early pioneers. If you enjoyed this video and want to continue exploring the past with us, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next chapter. We love having you here. Until next time, stay curious. Hey everyone, welcome back to our journey through history. Today, in Chapter 8, we peeling back the romanticized layers of exploration to confront the brutal realities faced by the first settlers. They arrived in a land of supposed promise, but what they found was a trial by fire, a crucible that would test the very limits of human endurance. This is the story of their early hardships. Imagine stepping off a cramped, storm-tossed ship after months at sea. You're weak, you're tired, but you're filled with hope. You see the lush, green coastline of a new world. But as you venture inland, that initial optimism begins to crumble. The first and most critical challenge was something we take for granted every single day: fresh water. While rivers and streams were plentiful, finding a source that was consistently safe to drink was a monumental task. Many water sources were brackish, contaminated, or seasonal. Settlers, weakened from their voyage, would drink from these tainted sources out of desperation, leading to dysentery and other waterborne illnesses that swept through the fledgling camps like wildfire. It was a cruel irony. A land surrounded by water, yet people were dying of thirst and disease. As the sun set, a new terror emerged. The air, thick and humid, would come alive with a deafening buzz. Swarms of mosquitoes, unlike anything they had ever experienced back in Europe, rose from the swamps and wetlands. These weren't just a nuisance, they were carriers of death. Malaria and yellow fever, transmitted by these relentless insects, became a constant, invisible threat. Fevers would spike, chills would rack the body, and many would slip into delirium from which they never awoke. The nights offered no reprieve from the day's heat, only a different kind of misery. A nightly battle against an enemy too numerous to fight. And the heat. Oh, the oppressive, suffocating heat. The summers were brutal. Clad in heavy woolen clothing completely unsuited for the climate, settlers struggled to perform even the most basic tasks. The sun beat down relentlessly, leading to heat stroke, dehydration, and exhaustion. The very air felt heavy, making every breath a chore and every movement a monumental effort. This wasn't the mild, temperate climate of England. It was a humid, subtropical furnace that drained their strength and sapped their will to survive. Compounding all these environmental horrors was a critical flaw in the composition of the early settlements. Many of the first arrivals were not rugged farmers or skilled laborers. They were gentlemen, second sons of nobility, soldiers, and adventurers who had come seeking gold and glory, not a life of toil. They were utterly unprepared for the backbreaking work required to build a colony from scratch. They didn't know how to clear dense forests, cultivate unfamiliar soil, or build sturdy shelters. They looked down on manual labor, viewing it as beneath their station. This cultural arrogance proved to be a fatal miscalculation. While they wasted precious time and energy searching for non-existent gold mines, the real treasures, fertile land, and the knowledge to work it, lay ignored. Fields went unplanted. Shelters remained flimsy and exposed to the elements. The basic necessities of survival were neglected in favor of pipe dreams. You had men who could debate philosophy or handle a sword, but who couldn't swing an axe or plant a seed to save their lives, literally. This mismatch of skills and expectations created a disastrous situation. When food supplies from the ship ran out, they had no way to replenish them. Starvation became a grim and constant companion. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine watching your friends and family, people you crossed an ocean with, succumb one by one to disease, hunger, and despair. The initial hope that fueled their journey curdled into a gnawing fear. The vibrant green of the new world began to look like a cage, a beautiful but deadly prison from which there was no escape. Morale plummeted. The social fabric of the settlement frayed as desperation led to infighting, hoarding, and a breakdown of command. It was a perfect storm of environmental hostility and human unpreparedness. Yet, amidst this catalogue of suffering, the seeds of resilience were sown. Those who survived this initial starving time were fundamentally changed. They were hardened by what they had endured. The gentlemen who once scoffed at labor learned to swing an axe until the soil, or they perished. They learned from their mistakes, often at a terrible cost. They began to understand that survival in this new world wasn't about finding gold. It was about cooperation, adaptation, and sheer, bloody-minded persistence. This brutal initiation forged a new kind of person, one who was tougher, more practical, and more attuned to the realities of their environment. The hardship was a cruel but effective teacher, stripping away old-world illusions and forcing the colonists to confront the raw, unforgiving nature of the life they had chosen. Their survival against such overwhelming odds is, in itself, a testament to the indomitable nature of the human spirit. These early years were a harrowing chapter, a story written in sweat, tears, and blood, but they were also the necessary foundation upon which everything else was built. The lessons learned in these desperate times would shape the future of the colonies for generations to come. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into the early struggles of the settlers. It's a sobering but crucial part of the story. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next chapter. We'd love to have you with us as we continue to explore the past. See you next time. Welcome back to our journey through the early days of Jamestown. In our last chapter, we saw the settlers struggling to survive. Today, we're diving into Chapter 9, a pivotal moment in their story. Their first significant encounters with the original inhabitants of this land, the Powhatan people. Imagine arriving in a completely new world, everything unfamiliar, from the plants to the animals. Now, Imagine meeting the people who have called this place home for centuries. This wasn't just one tribe. It was a powerful and sophisticated network of communities known as the Powhatan Confederacy. At the head of this confederacy was a shrewd and influential leader, a man the English would come to know as Chief Powhatan. His actual name was Wahunsunakaw, and he was the paramount chief, the leader of leaders, governing over 30 distinct Algonquian-speaking tribes. Think of him as the king of this vast coastal plain of Virginia, which they called. His authorities stretched from the shores of the Atlantic inland to the falls of the rivers. He was a master politician and a formidable leader who had consolidated his power through a combination of diplomacy, marriage, alliances, and, when necessary, force. He was respected and, at times, feared by all in the region. When the English ships sailed up the James River and established their fort, they weren't just settling on empty land. They were intruding into the heart of Powhatan's domain. So, how did this powerful chief and his people react to these strange newcomers? The relationship was complex from the very beginning, a delicate and often unpredictable dance between curiosity, cooperation, and conflict. Initially, there was a sense of cautious curiosity on both sides. The Powhatan people, with their deep knowledge of the land, observed the English with keen interest. They were expert farmers, hunters, and fishermen. They lived in villages of longhouses made from bark and woven mats, and their society was rich with tradition and ceremony. The English, on the other hand, were completely out of their element. They were weak from their long voyage, short on supplies, and ignorant of how to survive in this new environment. This imbalance led to the first interactions. Trade. The settlers desperately needed food, and the Powhatan had it in abundance. Corn, or maize, was the lifeblood of their society. They also had beans, squash, fish, and wild game. The English had things the Powhatan found intriguing and valuable: copper, metal tools, and glass beads. So, a fragile system of trade began. Captain John Smith, who you'll remember as a key figure in Jamestown, was instrumental in these early exchanges. He would venture out from the fort, sometimes with just a few men, to negotiate with various tribes for food. These trading sessions could be friendly. Picture this: English soldiers in their heavy armor and Powhatan warriors, with their bows and arrows, cautiously exchanging goods. There might be gestures, attempts at learning each other's languages, moments of shared humanity. The Powhatan people might offer a share of their meal, a gesture of hospitality. The English might demonstrate one of their metal hatchets, a tool far more durable than the stone tools the Powhatan used. For a moment there was a glimmer of hope for a peaceful coexistence. The English were dependent on the Powhatan for their very survival, and the Powhatan saw a potential opportunity for new alliances and access to new technologies. However, these peaceful moments were often overshadowed by a deep-seated mistrust and misunderstanding. The two cultures had fundamentally different views on almost everything, especially land. For the Powhatan, land wasn't something you could own, buy, or sell. It was a shared resource, a gift from the Creator to be used and respected. The English, however, came with a concept of private property and royal charters, believing they had a right to claim the land for their king and country. This clash of worldviews was a ticking time bomb. Tensions quickly escalated. The English settlers, driven by hunger and desperation, sometimes resorted to demanding food or even stealing it when trade wasn't forthcoming. This, of course, was seen as a grave insult and a hostile act by the Powhatan. Why would they continue to help people who were aggressive and disrespectful? From the Powhatan perspective, the English were becoming a dangerous nuisance. They were clearing forests for their fort and farms, depleting game, and acting as if they owned the place. The danger was real and ever-present. A small group of settlers wandering too far from the fort could easily fall into an ambush. A trading party could suddenly find themselves surrounded by warriors, their friendly demeanor replaced by cold hostility. The sound of a war cry in the woods would send chills down the spine of any colonist. The Powhatan were skilled warriors, masters of camouflage and surprise attacks. They fought to defend their homes, their families, and their way of life. The English, with their muskets, had a technological advantage, but the Powhatan had the home field advantage in superior numbers. The forests that the English saw as a source of wood were, for the Powhatan, a network of familiar paths and strategic hiding places. Chief Powhatan himself played a careful game. He was a brilliant strategist. Sometimes he would authorize trade, using the English presence to his advantage against rival inland tribes. Other times, he would cut off the food supply completely, hoping to starve the intruders out and force them to leave. He observed their weaknesses, their internal squabbles, their inability to feed themselves, their susceptibility to disease. He was trying to figure out if these newcomers could be controlled, assimilated, or if they needed to be eliminated entirely. This constant swing between friendly trade and violent conflict defined daily life in Jamestown. One day, a settler might be trading beads for a basket of corn with a Powhatan woman. The next day he might be defending the fort's walls from an attack by her husband or brother. This uncertainty was psychologically draining for the colonists and created an atmosphere of perpetual fear and anxiety. They were trapped between starvation inside their fort and the threat of attack outside it. The relationship was a roller coaster of highs and lows. There were moments of genuine connection and cultural exchange, but they were always fragile, easily shattered by the underlying tensions of a colonial encounter. Neither side fully understood the other's intentions or motivations, leading to a cycle of action and reaction that often spiraled into violence. This complicated dynamic part trade partner, part adversary is crucial to understanding the Jamestown story. The settlers were not alone in a vast wilderness. They were on someone else's land, interacting with a complex and powerful society. The story of Jamestown is as much the story of the Powhatan people as it is of the English settlers. Their interactions would shape the future of Virginia and, indeed, the entire continent. And at the center of it all was Chief Wahunsinuka, or Powhatan, trying to navigate the greatest challenge his people had ever faced. His decisions, his strategies, and his relationship with figures like John Smith would become the stuff of legend. Thank you so much for joining us for this chapter. The story is getting more intense, and the stakes are getting higher. If you're enjoying this deep dive into history, please hit that like button, and make sure you resubscribe so you don't miss our next chapter. We love having you as part of our history community. See you next time. Upbeat, adventurous music intro fades into the background. Hello! And welcome back to our historical deep dive. Today, we're journeying back to the early 17th century, to the fledgling, struggling colony of Jamestown. In this untamed wilderness, one man's iron will would forge the difference between survival and total collapse. We're talking about the one and only Captain John Smith, a figure far more complex and fascinating than the Disney movie might have you believe. When Smith arrived in Virginia in 1607, Jamestown was a disaster waiting to happen. The settlers, many of whom were gentlemen unaccustomed to manual labor, were more interested in prospecting for gold than in planting crops or building proper shelters. They were starving, succumbing to disease, and utterly unprepared for the harsh realities of the New World. The colony was teetering on the brink of extinction. It was a chaotic mess of desperation and poor planning. The initial leadership was weak, and factions were constantly bickering. They needed a leader, not a committee. They needed someone with grit, experience, and an unwavering focus on survival. Enter Captain John Smith. Now, Smith was no stranger to hardship. Before ever setting foot in America, he had been a soldier of fortune, fighting across Europe, captured and enslaved by Turks, and had even escaped by killing his captor. This was a man who had looked death in the eye and laughed. It was tough, pragmatic, and possessed an almost unbelievable amount of self-confidence. He saw the chaos in Jamestown and knew exactly what needed to be done. He wasn't there to make friends. He was there to ensure the colony survived. Smith quickly took charge of the dysfunctional Colonial Council. He organized work details, led expeditions to explore the surrounding territory, and, most crucially, established trade with the local Powhatan tribes. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Smith understood that brute force alone wouldn't work. He learned some of their language and customs, engaging in a delicate and often tense diplomacy to secure the corn and other food supplies that kept the colonists from starving during those first brutal winters. These were not simple grocery runs. They were high-stakes negotiations deep in unfamiliar territory, often with the threat of conflict hanging in the air. His leadership style was direct, sometimes even authoritarian, but it was exactly what the situation demanded. He had little patience for the idleness of the gentlemen who believed manual labor was beneath them. This frustration led to his most famous, and arguably his most effective policy, a simple, non-negotiable rule that would echo through history. He who will not work shall not eat. This wasn't just a catchy phrase. It was a declaration of a new social order. In Jamestown, under Smith, your survival depended not on your social standing back in England, but on your contribution to the community. Imagine the shock. These gentlemen, who had servants to do everything for them, were suddenly told to pick up an axe, or a hoe, or face starvation. It was a radical idea. Smith forced everyone, regardless of rank, to contribute. They were to cut wood, build fortifications, plant corn, and fish. There were grumblings and outright complaints, of course. Some even plotted against him. But Smith's resolve was unshakable. He knew that their very lives depended on this disciplined labor, and slowly, painstakingly, it began to work. Under his command, the colonists built better housing, dug a well for fresh water, and planted dozens of acres of crops. The fort became more secure, and a semblance of order replaced the initial chaos. Smith's time as the leader of Jamestown was relatively short, lasting just over a year until a severe gunpowder injury forced him to return to England in 1609. But his impact was immense. After he left, the colony descended into the infamous starving time, a horrific winter where the population was decimated by famine. The discipline and order Smith had instilled collapsed without his strong hand to guide them. This tragic period only served to highlight just how critical his leadership had been. He had been the linchpin holding the entire enterprise together. So, when we look back at Captain John Smith, we see more than just a character in a story. We see a powerful example of crisis leadership. He was a man of action, a pragmatist who understood that in the wilderness, practical skills and hard work were worth more than all the gold and titles in England. His famous rule, "He who will not work shall not eat," wasn't born of cruelty, but of a desperate, clear-eyed necessity. It was the principle that saved Jamestown from an early grave and laid the groundwork, however rough, for what would eventually become the United States. He was the right man, at the right time, in the right, very difficult place. Thank you so much for joining me on this historical adventure today. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button. And do not forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the people and events that shaped our world. Let me know in the comments what you think about John Smith's leadership style. Was he a hero or a tyrant? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, stay curious. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're rediving deep into one of the most enduring legends of early American history, the story of Pocahontas. Now, I know what you're thinking. You've probably seen the movies, read the books, and you know the famous scene. Captain John Smith, the English explorer, is captured by the Powhatan tribe. He's about to be executed, his head laid upon a stone, when suddenly a young girl, the chief's own daughter, Pocahontas, rushes forward, placing her head upon his to save his life. It's a powerful, dramatic moment, a tale of love, courage, and the bridging of two vastly different worlds. This single act has been immortalized in art, literature, and film for centuries, becoming a foundational myth of the United States. But here's the question we're going to explore today. Did it actually happen? Is this iconic story a historical fact? Or is it a beautifully crafted legend that tells us more about the people who told it than the events themselves? Let's journey back to the early 17th century, to the marshy shores of Virginia, and try to uncover the truth behind the legend of Pocahontas and John Smith. To understand this story, we first need to understand the man who told it, Captain John Smith. He was, to put it mildly, an extraordinary character. Before he even set foot in North America, he had lived a life that sounds like something out of an adventure novel. He was a soldier, a mercenary, who claimed to have fought all over Europe, battled Ottoman Turks, been captured, enslaved, and escaped in a daring and dramatic fashion. Smith was a self-promoter, a braggart, and a brilliant writer who knew how to spin a good yarn. His accounts of his adventures were bestsellers in England, and he was very conscious of crafting his own legacy. So, When he arrived in Virginia in 1607 with the first English colonists to establish Jamestown, he wasn't just there to survive, he was there to make his mark on history. The colony's early days were brutal. Starvation, disease, and conflict with the native Powhatan Confederacy were constant threats. Smith, with his military experience and sheer force of will, quickly emerged as a leader. He was practical and resourceful, known for his strict "he who will not work shall not eat" policy, which, while harsh, probably saved the struggling colony from complete collapse in its first year. It was during one of his exploratory and trading missions in December 1607 that the key event supposedly took place. Smith was leading a small party up the Chickahominy River when he was ambushed and captured by a hunting party led by Opatankino, the brother of the paramount chief Now, what happened next is the source of all the debate. For several weeks, Smith was taken from village to village, essentially on a tour of the Powhatan Empire. He was treated not as a simple prisoner, but as a significant figure. Finally, he was brought before the great Chief Powhatan himself at his capital, and this is where we get to the famous account. In his book, The General History of Virginia, New England, and the Summer Isles, published in 1624. Smith describes the scene. He writes that a great feast was held, after which a long consultation took place. Then, 2 large stones were brought before Smith says his head was forced onto them, and warriors stood ready with clubs to end his life. But just as they were about to strike, Pocahontas, the king's dearest daughter, when no entreaty could prevail, got his head in her arms, and laid her own upon his to save him from death. Following this, Powhatan declared that Smith should live to make him hatchets, and for Pocahontas to have bells, beads, and copper. It's a gripping story. The problem is, John Smith didn't tell it this way at first. In his earliest account of his captivity, a letter published back in England in 1608, called A True Relation of Virginia, he describes being captured and meeting Powhatan, but he makes absolutely no mention of a dramatic rescue by Pocahontas. He describes his time with Powhatan as a largely civil affair, a series of negotiations and cultural exchanges. He mentions Pocahontas elsewhere in his early writings, but only as a playful, precocious child who would visit Jamestown with her attendants. There is no hint of a life-or-death situation or a heroic intervention. So why the change in the story? Why did this dramatic rescue scene suddenly appear in his 1624 account, a full 17 years after it supposedly happened? This is where historians and scholars are deeply divided. One theory is simple: I made it up. By 1624, both Pocahontas and Powhatan were no longer alive. Pocahontas had become a famous figure in England after she had traveled there with her husband, John Rolfe. She was presented at court and was seen as a symbol of the tamed savage and the potential for a peaceful relationship between the English and Native Americans. By inserting this dramatic story, Smith could place himself at the very center of this now famous narrative. He could make himself the hero of a story that had captivated the English public, linking his own fate directly with a celebrated Indian princess. It was a brilliant piece of self-marketing. However, there's another, more complex interpretation that many anthropologists and historians now favor. What if John Smith wasn't lying, but was simply misinterpreting what was happening to him? It's possible that the entire event wasn't an execution attempt at all, but rather a highly symbolic ritual. In this view, the execution was a staged piece of theater. It was a ceremony designed to symbolize the death of John Smith as a stranger, an outsider, and his rebirth as a member of the tribe, adopted and subordinate to Chief Pocahontas's role as his savior would have been a pre-planned part of the ritual, symbolizing her role as his sponsor or godmother in this new tribal identity. This would explain why Powhatan immediately declared Smith his friend and a subordinate chief, or werewance, tasked with providing the tribe with English goods. Smith, a 17th-century European soldier with no understanding of Powhatan culture, would have seen only a literal threat to his life and a surprising rescue. He wouldn't have grasped the complex symbolic meaning of the ceremony. He interpreted the event through his own cultural lens, seeing a savage execution and a romantic rescue, rather than a political and spiritual adoption ritual. This theory is compelling because it fits with what we know about the rituals of other Algonquian-speaking tribes in the region. So, where does that leave the legend? It means the story of Pocahontas saving John Smith is probably not true in the way we always imagined it. She likely didn't act on a spontaneous impulse of love or compassion to save a condemned man, but she did play a crucial, symbolic role in a complex political ceremony that John Smith himself didn't fully understand. Pocahontas, whose real name was Matoka, was an incredibly important figure. She was an ambassador, a negotiator, and a vital link between her people and the English settlers during those critical early years. Her story is far more complex and significant than the one-dimensional princess of the legend. She was a diplomat caught between two worlds, and her life, though short, had a profound impact on the course of history. The famous story, whether a misunderstanding or a fabrication, has overshadowed the real, intelligent, and influential woman she was. It's a powerful reminder that history is often not about what happened, but about who gets to tell the story and how they tell it. The tale of her saving John Smith tells us a great deal about English colonial attitudes and their desire for a narrative that justified their presence in a new land. But the true story of Matoka, the daughter of Powhatan, is even more fascinating. Thank you so much for joining me on this historical investigation. It's a story with layers of meaning, and it challenges us to look beyond the popular myths. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button. And do you want to forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss our next deep dive into history? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Smith was lying or just misunderstood? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Imagine, if you will, a world stripped bare. The vibrant colors of autumn have faded into a stark, unforgiving canvas of gray and white. The year is 1609, and for the handful of English settlers huddled within the flimsy wooden walls of Jamestown, Virginia, this isn't just another winter. This is the beginning of a nightmare. This is the story of the starving time. Just a few months earlier, hope had arrived on a fleet of new ships, swelling the colony's population to nearly 500 souls. But that hope was a fleeting mirage. The flagship, carrying most of the supplies and experienced leaders, was shipwrecked in Bermuda. What arrived in Jamestown was a crowd of unprepared, unruly people, landing right at the doorstep of the most brutal winter the colony had yet faced. The leader of the colony, the capable Captain John Smith, who had managed to forge a fragile peace and trade relationship with the native Powhatan Confederacy, was gone. A gunpowder accident had forced him to return to England, leaving a gaping void in leadership. The Powhatan, wary and increasingly hostile towards the ever-expanding English presence, saw their chance. The loose alliance crumbled. Chief Powhatan decided to lay siege to Jamestown, cutting off the colonists from their primary sources of food: hunting, fishing, and trade. The fort became a prison, and the people inside, its inmates. At first, they ate the remaining livestock. The hogs, the goats, the chickens. All were quickly consumed. Then, they moved on to the horses. Once the last hoof had been boiled, a new, more desperate hunger set in. The communal storehouse, the symbol of their collective hope, was empty. Its barren shelves echoed the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. People began to eat anything they could find: cats, dogs, rats, and mice that scurried through the muddy streets became prized meals. They boiled the leather from their own shoes and belts, chewing on the tough, tasteless material just to have something in their mouths. As the weeks dragged on, the situation grew more dire. The bitter cold seeped through the cracks in their daub and wattle homes, chilling them to the bone. Sickness ran rampant. Dysentery and typhoid, fueled by malnutrition and poor sanitation, tore through the weakened population. The cries of the sick and the dying became the daily soundtrack of Jamestown. The living grew too weak to bury the dead. Bodies were left in houses, in the streets, a constant, grim reminder of their own mortality. The psychological toll was immense. Hope withered and died, replaced by a primal, all-consuming desperation. Social order disintegrated. Trust evaporated. Neighbor looked at neighbor not with compassion, but with a terrifying calculation. The bonds of civilization, stretched to their breaking point, finally snapped. Dark whispers turned into horrifying realities. To survive, some resorted to the ultimate taboo, digging up the recently buried to consume their remains. It's a gruesome detail, one that historians and archaeologists have since confirmed, a testament to the absolute rock bottom of human suffering. Imagine the state of mind a person must be in to make that choice. It wasn't malice. It was the last, desperate act of a body and mind screaming for survival against impossible odds. One man, driven mad by hunger, murdered his pregnant wife and salted her flesh to eat. When his crime was discovered, what was left of the colony's leadership executed him. It was a brief, horrific punctuation mark in a long sentence of suffering. This was no longer the grand adventure they had been promised. This was a frozen, starving hell on earth. Throughout this agonizing winter, the Powhatan siege held firm. Any colonist who dared to venture beyond the fort's palisades was likely to be met with a swift, violent end. The very land that was supposed to be their paradise had become their cage, and its native inhabitants, their jailers. The colonists were utterly, completely trapped. Finally, after what must have felt like an eternity, the ice on the James River began to break. Spring arrived, not with a gentle promise of renewal, but with the grim task of counting the survivors. Of the nearly 500 people who had started the winter in Jamestown, only about 60 remained. 60 skeletal, traumatized souls, ghosts haunting the ruins of a failed dream. They were so weak they could barely stand. The fort was a wreck, the houses were falling apart, and the fields were unplanted. There was no food, and no strength left to find any. Just as the last embers of hope were about to be extinguished, a miracle appeared on the horizon. In May of 1610, the shipwrecked survivors from Bermuda, including the colony's new governor, Sir Thomas Gates, finally arrived. They had built 2 small ships from the wreckage of their own, but the sight that greeted them was not a thriving colony, but a charnel house. They found the handful of survivors in a state of utter despair. Seeing the catastrophic state of Jamestown, Governor Gates made a difficult but logical decision. The colony was to be abandoned. It was a failure. The survivors were loaded onto the ships, and they prepared to sail for the fishing fleets off Newfoundland and then back to England. The Great Virginia Experiment was over as they sailed down the James River, leaving behind the graves, the ghosts, and the nightmares of the starving time. It must have felt like a final, bitter defeat. But history, as we know, had one more twist in store. Just as they were about to reach the open sea, they encountered another fleet of ships sailing towards them. It was Lord Delaware, with 150 new colonists and, most importantly, a year's worth of supplies. He ordered everyone to turn back. Jamestown, the colony that was literally minutes from being abandoned to history, was given a second chance. The starving time stands as one of the darkest chapters in American history. It's a brutal, unfiltered look at what happens when optimism collides with reality, when preparedness is lacking, and when the delicate balance between cultures is shattered. It's a story of desperation and the terrifying lengths people will go to survive. But it is also, in its own grim way, a story of endurance. Those 60 survivors, who lived through hell itself, became the foundation upon which a new society would eventually be built. Their story is a chilling but essential reminder of the true cost of establishing a foothold in the New World. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this story compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what you think about this incredible story of survival. We'll see you in the next video. Picture this: a handful of exhausted, starving colonists huddled together on a remote, unforgiving island. The sky is a leaden gray, mirroring the despair in their hearts. Their supplies have dwindled to almost nothing. Every creak of the wind sounds like a death knell, and every sunrise reveals the same grim reality. They are alone, and they are dying. This was the desperate situation for the survivors at Jamestown in the spring of 1610. A period so horrific it would be forever known as the starving time. But then, one day, a speck appears on the horizon. Is it a trick of the light? A hallucination brought on by hunger? No. The speck grows larger, resolving into the unmistakable shape of a ship's sail. Then another, and another. A fleet, hope, a feeling long thought dead, flickers back to life. These weren't just any ships. This was the third supply, a mission that had been battered by a hurricane, shipwrecked in Bermuda, and given up for lost. Aboard were new settlers, precious food, and a man who would change everything. Lord Delaware. Welcome back to our series on the founding of America. Today, we're telling the incredible story of how Jamestown, on the absolute brink of collapse, was miraculously saved by the timely arrival of supply ships. It's a tale of near disaster, incredible resilience, and the dramatic 11th-hour rescue that secured England's foothold in the New World. To truly grasp the significance of this moment, we need to rewind a bit. The winter of 1609 to 1610 was catastrophic. The colony's already strained relationship with the Powhatan Confederacy had completely shattered. The indigenous people, tired of the settlers' constant demands for food, laid siege to the fort. The English were trapped, unable to hunt, fish, or forage. They ate their horses, then their dogs, cats, rats, and mice. The situation became so dire, so unimaginably grim, that some resorted to the unthinkable just to survive. Of the 500 colonists who began that winter, only about 60 remained by spring. They were skeletons, hollowed-out shells of human beings, their spirits broken. The acting leader, George Percy, himself sick and weak, made a heart-wrenching decision. They would abandon Jamestown. It was a failed experiment, a death trap. Their plan was simple: sail up the Chesapeake Bay, hoping to find a friendly English fishing vessel that could take them home. They buried their cannons, packed what little they had, and boarded their small, Histele-built pinnaces, the Asterisk, Patience Asterisk, and the Asterisk, Deliverance Asterisk. Ironically named ships, built by the survivors of the Bermuda shipwreck. As they sailed down the James River, they didn't look back. For all they knew, they were leaving a graveyard. The final chapter of a tragic story, but history, as it so often does, had a twist in store. Just as they were about to enter the vast expanse of the Chesapeake Bay, they saw a longboat approaching. The men in the boat brought staggering news. Lord Delaware, the new governor of Virginia, had arrived with a fleet of 3 ships and 150 new settlers. He was anchored just a few miles away at Point Comfort. He had brought not just men, but something the colony desperately needed more than anything: order, discipline, and an abundance of supplies. Can you imagine the wave of emotion that washed over those 60 survivors? The shock, the disbelief, the overwhelming, tearful relief. The journey back up the river to Jamestown must have been surreal. They had left that morning to abandon it forever. They were returning that evening to rebuild it. It was nothing short of a resurrection. Lord Delaware was a different kind of leader. Thomas West, the 12th Baron Delaware, was a veteran military man from a powerful English family. He wasn't an adventurer seeking gold. He was a governor tasked with saving a crucial investment for the Virginia Company. He arrived with the authority to impose martial law, and he did not hesitate to use it. When he stepped ashore at Jamestown, he was appalled by what he found. The fort was in ruins, the houses were falling apart, and the fields were overgrown with weeds. The survivors were weak and demoralized. Delaware immediately set to work. His first act was to lead the colonists in a prayer of thanks. Then, he read his commission, establishing his authority, and laid out a new, rigid set of rules. The days of idleness and internal squabbling were over. The colony was now run with military precision. A bell would ring to wake everyone for morning prayer, then for work, for meals, and for evening prayer. Everyone, regardless of their social standing back in England, was given a job. Some were to rebuild the fort and houses, others to plant crops, and still others to fish and trade cautiously with the native tribes. Work was no longer optional. Shirk your duties, and you faced harsh punishment. This new regime was called the Laws Divine, Morrow and Marshall. It was strict, to be sure, and would seem incredibly harsh to us today. Punishments for crimes like theft or running away could be severe, but for a colony that had been teetering on the edge of anarchy and starvation, this iron-fisted discipline was a lifeline. It provided the structure and direction that had been fatally lacking. For the first time, Jamestown began to operate not as a collection of desperate individuals, but as a cohesive, functioning community with a single purpose: survival. Delaware's supplies were a godsend. Crates of food, flour, salted meat, cheese wary unloaded, providing immediate relief from the gnawing hunger. Tools, seeds, weapons, and livestock were also brought ashore. The sight of these provisions pouring into the long-empty storehouse must have been a powerful symbol of rebirth. Hope was no longer a distant flicker. It was a tangible, life-sustaining reality. The new governor also recognized the immediate need to re-establish a position of strength with the Powhatan. He understood that peace through weakness was impossible. He launched a series of aggressive campaigns against the tribes that had besieged the fort. While these actions were brutal and further fueled the conflict from the English perspective, they were a necessary evil to break the siege and secure the area around Jamestown, allowing the colonists to expand their farming and hunting grounds without constant fear of attack. In a matter of weeks, the entire atmosphere of Jamestown was transformed. The dilapidated fort was repaired. New houses were built. Fields were cleared and planted with corn. The despair of the starving time was replaced by the disciplined hum of activity. Lord Delaware. His arrival didn't just save 60 lives. It saved the entire English project in North America. Had those survivors sailed out into the Chesapeake Bay just one day earlier? Had Lord Delaware's fleet been delayed by a single storm? The story of the United States might be completely different. The Spanish or French could have easily claimed the abandoned territory, and the English-speaking nation we know today might never have come to be. The arrival of the supply ships in June 1610 is one of the most dramatic and crucial turning points in early American history. It's a powerful reminder that history often pivots on a knife's edge, on moments of incredible luck, timing, and the determination of key individuals. The starving time showed the depths of human suffering, but the rescue that followed showed the resilience of the human spirit. Jamestown had been to hell and back, but it had survived. The colony was saved, its future secured, and the foundation for a new nation was, against all odds, finally beginning to take hold. Thanks for watching. This story of survival is just one of many that shaped the early days of America. If you found this fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the events that made history. And don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next episode. See you next time. Ever wonder how a tiny seed completely transformed a fledgling colony and shaped the future of an entire nation? Today, we're diving deep into the story of Virginia and its golden weed tobacco. This isn't just a story about a plant. It's a story about survival, ambition, and the birth of the American economy. Let's set the scene. It's the early 1600s. The English settlement of Jamestown, Virginia, is on the brink of collapse. The colonists are struggling. They came seeking gold and riches, but instead, they found starvation, disease, and conflict. The London Company, which funded the expedition, was getting impatient. They needed to see a return on their investment, and fast. The colony's very existence was hanging by a thread. They tried everything: glassmaking, silk production, shipping timber back to England, but nothing was profitable enough to sustain them. The dream was dying. Enter a man named John Rolfe. You might know him as the guy who married Pocahontas, but his most significant contribution to American history was something entirely different. Rolfe was an astute businessman and an experimental farmer. He saw that the local Native Americans were growing a type of tobacco, but it was harsh and bitter to European tastes. The popular tobacco in Europe came from the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, a sweet and aromatic variety that England had to import at great expense. The Spanish guarded their seeds fiercely, making it a capital offense to sell them to foreigners. But Rolfe was determined. Somehow, and the historical records are a bit murky on the exact details, he managed to acquire seeds of this coveted Spanish tobacco, Nicotiana tobacco. This was a massive gamble. Would it even grow in Virginia's soil? He began experimenting in 1612, planting these foreign seeds along the James River. He carefully cultivated the plants, developing new curing methods to adapt to the Virginian climate. The result was nothing short of miraculous. The tobacco that grew in Virginia's soil was a spectacular success. It was sweet, fragrant, and highly desirable. In 1614, Rolfe sent his first shipment of this new Virginia-grown tobacco to London. It caused a sensation. The English market went wild for it. It was smoother than the native tobacco and cheaper than the Spanish import. Suddenly, Jamestown had found its treasure. It wasn't gold, But it was green and it was profitable. They called it the golden weed. This changed everything. The promise of wealth from tobacco cultivation triggered a tobacco rush. Colonists abandoned all other pursuits to plant tobacco. It was grown in the streets of Jamestown, in every available patch of cleared land. The allure of quick riches attracted a wave of new immigrants to Virginia. The colony, once on the verge of extinction, began to boom. The London Company finally had its profitable commodity. Tobacco became the economic engine of Virginia. It was more than just a crop. It was the colony's currency. Colonists used tobacco to pay taxes, buy goods, and even purchase indentured servants and, later, enslaved Africans. A man's wealth and social standing were measured by the amount of tobacco he produced. Huge plantations began to sprout up along the rivers, which served as highways to transport the massive barrels of tobacco to waiting ships bound for England. This new plantation economy created a distinct social structure. At the top were the wealthy planters, who owned vast tracts of land and controlled the political and economic life of the colony. Below them were smaller farmers, and at the bottom was a growing labor force. Initially, this labor was provided by indentured servants, people who agreed to work for a set number of years in exchange for passage to the New World. However, the labor demands of tobacco were immense. It's a notoriously difficult crop to cultivate, requiring year-round attention, from planting the tiny seeds in seed beds to transplanting them, weeding, topping the plants to encourage leaf growth, and finally, the painstaking process of harvesting and curing. The supply of indentured servants could keep up with the ever-expanding demand for labor on these massive plantations. This insatiable demand for labor led to one of the most tragic and consequential developments in American history: the institutionalization of chattel slavery. In 1619, the same year the Virginia House of Burgesses was formed, a Dutch ship arrived carrying 20-odd Africans. While their initial status was complex, the economic logic of tobacco cultivation pushed Virginia towards a system of permanent, inherited slavery. It was a cheaper, more permanent labor source for the planters, and it became inextricably linked to the success of the golden weed. So, the legacy of tobacco is incredibly complex. On one hand, it saved the Virginia colony from failure. It created immense wealth, funded the expansion of the British Empire in America, and laid the economic groundwork for what would eventually become the United States. The desire for more land to grow tobacco was a major driver of westward expansion and conflict with Native American tribes. On the other hand, its success was built on a foundation of exploitation. It drove the demand for indentured servitude and, most significantly, was a primary catalyst for the growth of slavery in the American South, a system whose brutal legacy continues to impact society today. The story of Virginia's golden weed is a powerful reminder of how a single commodity can shape the destiny of a nation, creating fortunes for some while fueling immense suffering for others. It's a crucial chapter in understanding the complex origins of America. Thanks for watching this deep dive into America's past. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that shaped our world. Let us know in the comments what piece of history you'd like us to explore next. See you in the next video. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey through early America. In our last episode, we left off with Pocahontas being held captive in Jamestown, a tense situation teetering on the brink of all-out war. Today, we re-dive into a chapter that dramatically changed the course of relations between the English settlers and the power. A chapter defined not by conflict, but by an unexpected union. This is the story of Chapter 15. Peace through marriage. The year is 1613. Pocahontas has been a guest, or more accurately, a hostage, in the English settlement for over a year. During this time, she was instructed in the Christian faith, learned the English language and customs, and was eventually baptized, taking the English name Rebecca. It was during this period of immense cultural transition that she met a man who would alter her destiny and the destiny of her people forever. That man was John Rolfe. Now, you might be thinking of Captain John Smith, the figure so famously linked with Pocahontas in popular culture. But the historical reality is quite different. Smith had already returned to England years earlier due to a severe injury. The man who truly captured Pocahontas's heart was Rolfe, a respectable, pious, and widowed English tobacco planter. John Rolfe was an industrious, and ambitious men. He is credited with being the first person to successfully cultivate a marketable strain of tobacco in Virginia, a crop that would soon become the economic backbone of the colony. But he was also a man of deep faith, and he found himself in a profound moral and spiritual dilemma. He had fallen in love with Pocahontas. In a long, heartfelt letter to the governor, Sir Thomas Dale, Rolfe agonized over his decision. He expressed his love for Pocahontas, but framed his desire to marry her primarily as a means to save her soul, to bring her fully into the Christian faith, and to forge a lasting peace between their two peoples. He wrote of his hearty and best thoughts and his belief that this marriage was ordained by God. It was a complex mix of genuine affection, religious duty, and strategic thinking. Was it pure love? Was it a political calculation? History suggests it was likely a powerful combination of both. For Pocahontas, her motivations are less documented in her own words, but we can infer a great deal. She was a young woman in a foreign environment, separated from her family. She had shown incredible adaptability and intelligence, quickly mastering a new language and culture. In Rolfe, she may have found a genuine companion, a source of stability, and a partner who treated her with respect. Furthermore, as the daughter of the paramount chief, she would have been acutely aware of the political implications of her actions. Marion Rolfe offered a tangible path to peace, a way to protect her people from further bloodshed. It was a choice that required immense courage and foresight. With the approval of Governor Dale and, eventually, a reluctant blessing from her father, Chief Powell. The wedding took place in April of 1614 in the church at Jamestown. It was a momentous occasion. An English gentleman and a Native American princess, joining together in a Christian ceremony. This wasn't just a marriage between two individuals. It was a symbolic union of two vastly different worlds. The immediate effect was exactly what both sides had hoped for. The marriage ushered in a period of peace, often referred to as the Peace of Pocahontas. For the first time in years, the constant tension, the raids, and the skirmishes that had plagued the colony began to subside. The Powhatan people brought food to the starving settlers. The English could plant their crops and expand their settlements without the constant fear of attack. A fragile, yet real, sense of cooperation began to emerge. This peace allowed the Virginia colony to finally find its footing. With the threat of war diminished, John Rolfe's tobacco plantations flourished. The crop became brown gold, and its success fueled a wave of new investment and immigration from England. The colony, which had been on the brink of failure so many times, was now becoming a viable and profitable enterprise. The peace secured by this marriage was, in many ways, the foundation upon which the future of Virginia was built. Pocahontas, now known as Rebecca Rolfe, embraced her new role. A year later, in 1615, she gave birth to a son, Thomas Rolfe. The birth of their child further solidified the bond between the two cultures. Here was a child of both worlds, a living symbol of the potential for coexistence. The Virginia Company, the financial backers of the Jamestown settlement, saw an incredible public relations opportunity. They decided to bring the Roa family to England to showcase the success of the colony. They wanted to present Pocahontas as a civilized savage, proof that their mission to convert the native population was working. They hoped her presence would encourage new investors and colonists. In 1616, John, Rebecca, and their young son, Thomas, set sail for London. Pocahontas was treated as visiting royalty, a spectacle for the English court and public. She was presented before King James I and Queen Anne, impressing everyone with her composure, grace, and intelligence. She was living proof that the two worlds could not only meet, but merge. During this trip, she even had a brief, and reportedly awkward, reunion with Captain John Smith, whom she had believed to be dead for years. Tragically, this journey would be her last. As the Rolfe family prepared to return to Virginia in 1617, Pocahontas fell ill. The damp, cold climate of England and its unfamiliar diseases proved too much for her. She died at the age of just 21 or 22 and was buried in a churchyard in Gravesend, England, thousands of miles from her home. Her final words to her husband were reportedly, "All must die, but 'tis enough that my child liveth." Her death was a profound loss. While the peace she had helped forge would hold for a few more years, her role as the central bridge between the two cultures was irreplaceable. The Peace of Pocahontas was a testament to the power of one individual and one relationship to change the course of history. It was a brief, shining moment of hope and cooperation in a story too often defined by conflict and misunderstanding. The marriage of Pocahontas and John Rolfe demonstrates that even in the most fraught of circumstances, diplomacy, understanding, and even love can pave the way for peace. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. It's a story with layers of romance, politics, and tragedy, and it's central to understanding the early days of America. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll explore the aftermath of this fragile peace. We truly appreciate your support.
See you next time.
Upbeat, engaging music starts and fades into the background. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we're re-diving into a pivotal moment for a fledgling settlement that would one day shape the course of a nation. We're in Jamestown, and things are finally starting to look up. This is the story of Chapter 16. A growing colony. If you've been following along, you know Jamestown's early years were brutal. Starvation, disease, and constant uncertainty were the norms. But now, a new chapter is unfolding. The desperate, huddled fort we once knew is transforming. Look around. Where there were once just a few ramshackle huts, we now see the sturdy frames of new houses rising. The sound of hammers and saws fills the air, a symphony of progress and hope. This isn't just about building more shelters. It's about building a future. The colonists are no longer just surviving day to day. They are planning, investing, and putting down roots. The colony is physically expanding. The original palisade walls, once a tight boundary against a dangerous world, are now more of a memory. The settlement is spilling out, claiming the land with a newfound confidence. And what's fueling this expansion? Look over there, beyond the new homes. Fields and more fields. The colonists are clearing more land for agriculture than ever before. The lessons learned from the Powhatan, particularly about cultivating native crops like corn, are paying off. Tobacco, the cash crop that would soon define Virginia's economy, is being planted with vigor. These sprawling fields represent more than just food and potential wealth. They represent sustainability. For the first time, Jamestown is beginning to feed itself reliably, breaking the cycle of desperate reliance on supply ships from England. Every row of corn, every tobacco plant, is a testament to the colonists' resilience and their adaptation to this new world. They are no longer just Englishmen in a foreign land. They are becoming Virginians, people of this specific place, their lives intertwined with its soil. This agricultural boom is the engine driving the colony's growth, providing the stability needed for everything else to fall into place. But perhaps the most significant change, the one that truly signals a shift from a temporary outpost to a permanent colony, is the arrival of families. In the early days, Jamestown was overwhelmingly mala roof and tumble, collection of soldiers, adventurers, and gentlemen seeking fortune. It was a workplace, not a home. Now, ships are arriving with not just supplies, but with women and children. The presence of families changes the entire dynamic of the settlement. The laughter of children echoes through the newly built streets. Homes are no longer just barracks for sleeping. They are becoming centers of family life. This social shift is monumental. It brings a sense of stability, of community, and of permanence that was impossible before. Men are no longer just working for a company back in London. They are building lives for their wives and children right here. With families comes the establishment of a more structured society. We see the beginnings of a real community, with social gatherings, shared responsibilities, and a collective investment in the future. The presence of women introduces new skills and industries into the colony, from managing households to spinning and weaving. Jamestown is evolving from a military and commercial venture into a true, functioning society. Think about the psychological impact of this change. For a colonist standing here, watching new houses go up, seeing fields ripe for harvest, and hearing the sounds of a bustling community with families, the future must have suddenly seemed so much brighter. The dream of a successful English colony in America was no longer a distant fantasy. It was becoming a tangible reality, built board by board, and planted seed by seed. This period of growth wasn't without its challenges. Of course, relations with the native Powhatan Confederacy remained complex and often tense. Disease was still a threat, and the hard work of building a society from scratch was relentless, but the momentum had shifted. The colony had weathered its darkest storms and was now on a path of expansion. Jamestown was beginning to look more permanent, more like a proper English town transplanted to the shores of Virginia. The church stands as a central point, a symbol of their enduring faith and culture. A marketplace is likely taking shape, a hub for trade and social interaction. Streets are being laid out in a more orderly fashion. This isn't the chaotic, desperate camp of the starving time anymore. This is a place with a future. This transformation is the crucial turning point in our story. It's the moment Jamestown proves its viability. The investment of the Virginia Company is finally beginning to show a return, not just in potential profits from tobacco, but in the successful establishment of a self-sustaining English foothold in North America. This growing colony is the seed from which the massive tree of the United States would eventually sprout. What we're witnessing is the birth of an identity. These people are creating a new way of life, a blend of their English heritage and the realities of the American continent. They are pioneers in the truest sense, laying the foundations for generations to come. The permanence we see taking shape here in Jamestown will inspire further migration and the establishment of other colonies up and down the coast. The success of Jamestown sends a powerful message back to Europe. A life in the New World is not just possible, but desirable. And so, as we look out over this burgeoning settlement and new homes, the green fields, the families walking along the dusty paths, we see more than just a colony. We see the resilient, tenacious spirit of humanity, the powerful drive to build, to grow, and to create a home, no matter how challenging the circumstances. The small, fragile flame of Jamestown is now burning brightly, a beacon of what's to come. Thank you so much for joining me on this step of our historical exploration. It's incredible to see how far the colony has come. If you enjoyed this video and want to see what happens next in the story of Jamestown in early America, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter. We have so much more to discover together. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Hello history lovers, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're journeying back over 400 years to a pivotal, yet often overlooked, moment in the story of America. We're heading to the humid, mosquito-filled summer of 1619 in the fledgling colony of Jamestown, Virginia. While the colonists were battling the wilderness, something truly revolutionary was taking shape inside a simple wooden church. This is the story of the Virginia House of Burgesses, the very first representative assembly in English North America. Imagine this. It's July 30th, 1619. Jamestown is just 12 years old, a precarious toehold on the edge of a vast, unknown continent. The colonists who had survived the starving time were tough, but they were also subjects of the English crown, governed by the Virginia Company of London, a business venture thousands of miles away. They had no say in the laws that dictated their lives, the taxes they paid, or how their community was run. It was a top-down system, driven by profit and royal decree. But the Virginia Company realized something crucial. To attract more settlers and make the colony truly successful, they needed to offer more than just a chance at finding gold. They needed to offer a stake in the society itself. So, under the leadership of men like Sir Edwin Sandys, the company issued a new charter, often called the Great Charter. It was a game. It authorized the creation of a local legislative body, giving the colonists a voice. This wasn't an act of pure democratic idealism. It was also a practical business decision. Happy, invested colonists were more likely to be productive colonists. By giving them a measure of self-government, the company hoped to foster stability and encourage immigration. They were building not just an outpost, but a commonwealth. So, who were these first legislators? Were Khalid, Burgesses, an Old English term for a citizen or representative of a town or borough. Each of the 11 established settlements in Virginia was instructed to elect 2 representatives. These were landowners, the respected men of their small communities, chosen by their peers to speak for them. On that sweltering July day, 22 of these elected burgesses, along with the governor, Sir George Earl, and his appointed council, gathered in the choir of the Jamestown church, the largest building available. Can you picture the scene? These men, dressed in their heavy English woolens, crammed into a church in the oppressive Virginia heat. Governor Yeardley opened the session with a prayer, and then they got down to business. This wasn't just for show. They debated and passed real laws. Their first order of business was to examine the Great Charter itself to confirm their authority. Talk about getting meta! Then, they tackled the pressing issues of the day. They set a fixed price for the sale of tobacco, the colony's cash crop, to prevent price gouging. They passed laws against idleness, gambling, and drunkenness, attempting to impose moral order on a frontier society. They even enacted a law requiring every man to attend church twice on Sunday. These might seem like minor local ordinances now, but the principle was urged. For the first time on this continent, English settlers were making laws for themselves through representatives they had chosen. This first session was actually cut short after just 6 days. Why? The oppressive heat. One burgess had already died, and the rest were falling ill in the intemperature of the weather. Even so, the precedent had been set. The seed of American democracy had been planted in the fertile, if swampy, soil of Virginia. Now, we have to be honest and acknowledge the profound contradictions of this moment. The year 1619 is significant for 2 very different reasons. Even as these men were meeting to establish a government based on liberty and representation, another ship was crossing the Atlantic. Just a month later, in August 1619, the ship known as the White Lion arrived at Point Comfort, Virginia. It carried 20 and odd enslaved Africans, who were sold to the colonists. This is the great paradox of early America. The birth of democracy and the formal arrival of slavery happened in the same place, at the same time. The very men who were championing their own rights as Englishmen were participating in a system that would deny basic human rights to others for centuries. The House of Burgesses would later pass laws that entrenched and codified the institution of chattel slavery. This is a critical and tragic part of the story that we must never forget. The freedom being cultivated for some was built on the bondage of others. Despite this dark hypocrisy, the idea of representative government took root and grew. The House of Burgesses continued to meet, gaining more power and influence over the decades. It became a training ground for future leaders. When tensions with Great Britain began to escalate in the 1760s and 70s, where did the passionate voices of American liberty come from? They came from the Virginia House of Burgesses. Think of the names: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry. All of them cut their political teeth in the House of Burgesses. It was in that assembly that Patrick Henry famously declared, "Give me liberty, or give me death." It was a direct descendant of that first meeting in 1619. The experience of self-government, of debating taxes and rights for over 150 years, gave these men the confidence and the vocabulary to challenge the authority of a king and an empire. When the Continental Congress convened to declare independence, the model was already there. The idea that government derives its power from the consent of the governed was just a philosophical concept from John Locke. It was a lived reality for generations of Virginians. Thanks to the House of Burgesses, it provided the blueprint for our state legislatures and, eventually, the United States Congress. So, that small gathering in a hot Jamestown church in 1619 was more than just a town council meeting. It was the first step on a long, complicated, and often contradictory journey toward American democracy. It was the beginning of a tradition of self-rule that would define the nation's political identity. It established the powerful idea that people should have a say in their own governance, an idea that would eventually spark a revolution and inspire the world. The legacy of the House of Burgesses is a reminder that democracy is not an accident. It is designed, it is built, and it must be continually It's a messy, imperfect process, born from a mix of hymented ideals and practical self-interest, and tragically intertwined with deep injustice. But understanding this beginning, in all its complexity, is essential to understanding the United States today. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into history. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more stories about the moments that shaped our world. Let me know in the comments what you think about this pivotal year of 1619. Until next time, stay curious. Hello, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we delve into a year that casts a long and complex shadow over American history. 1619. This single year holds a paradox. It saw the birth of American democracy with the first representative assembly, but it also witnessed the arrival of the first recorded Africans in English North America, an event that planted the seeds of a system of bondage that would shape the nation for centuries to come. So, let us step back in time to the fledgling colony of Virginia and unravel the story of how a group of captured Africans found themselves at the very beginning of this dark chapter. Our story begins not in America, but on the sun-scorched plains of West Central Africa, in the kingdom of Indongo, part of modern-day Angola. Here, a powerful warrior queen named Gingamambandi was fighting desperately against Portuguese invaders and their local allies. The Portuguese sought to control the lucrative trade routes and, more sinisterly, to capture people to sell into the burgeoning transatlantic slave trade. In a series of brutal conflicts in 1618 and 1619, thousands of Ndongo people were captured. They were marched in chains, known as kofels, hundreds of miles to the coast, to the port of Luanda. There, they were packed into the suffocating, disease-ridden holds of slave ships, destined for a life of forced labor in the Spanish colonies of the New World. One such ship was the Snow Bautista. It was crammed with around 350 captive Africans, enduring a horrific journey known as the Middle Passage. Conditions were unimaginable. Disease, starvation, and despair were constant companions. But their intended destination was not to be their final one. As the Snow Bautista neared Veracruz, in what is now Mexico, it was attacked. Two English privateer ships, the White Lion and the Treasurer, intercepted the Portuguese vessel. In the 17th century, the lines between pirate and privateer were often blurred. These English ships, operating under letters of marque from a Dutch prince, were essentially state-sanctioned pirates, preying on Spanish and Portuguese shipping. During the skirmish, they seized some of the human cargo, around 50 to 60 of the enslaved Africans. Before sailing north, in late August of 1619, the White Lion, low on supplies, sailed into Point Comfort, a small but significant port in the English colony of Virginia. The ship's captain, John Jope, traded his 20-and-odd African captives for vital provisions. The colony's secretary, John Rofer, very same man famous for his marriage to Pocahontas, meticulously recorded their arrival. He didn't call them slaves. He didn't call them by their names. He simply documented the arrival of Africans, marking a moment that would forever alter the destiny of the colony and the future United States. A few days later, the treasurer arrived and sold a few more of the captives. These were the first recorded Africans to set foot in English North America. But what did their arrival mean? Were they immediately enslaved for life? The answer is more complicated than a simple yes or no. The concept of chattel slavery, where people are treated as property and their children are born into bondage, had not yet been fully codified into Virginia law. In 1619, the primary labor system in the colony was indentured servitude. Poor English, Irish, and other European immigrants would sign contracts or indentures, agreeing to work for a master for a set period, typically 4 to 7 years, in exchange for passage to the New World and the promise of land or freedom dues upon completion. Many of the first Africans, like Anthony and Isabella, were likely treated in a similar manner as indentured servants. They worked alongside white servants, facing brutal conditions on the tobacco plantations that were the economic engine of the colony. For a brief period, there was a slim possibility of freedom. Some early Africans did complete their terms of service, acquire land, and even own servants themselves. A man named Anthony Johnson, who arrived in the 1620s, became a successful tobacco farmer and landowner in his own right after gaining his freedom. These stories represent a fleeting moment of possibility, a different path that history could have taken. However, the tide was turning against them. The insatiable demand for labor to cultivate the profitable but labor-intensive tobacco crop created immense pressure. Landowners sought a more permanent, exploitable workforce. Unlike European servants who had legal rights under English law and a finite term of service, the Africans were vulnerable. They were strangers in a strange land, cut off from their homes and legal systems. They were not Christian, which colonists used as a justification for different treatment. And most visibly, the color of their skin was used to mark them as outsiders, as other, slowly but surely. Through a series of court decisions and new laws passed by the Virginia House of Burgesses, the status of Africans began to change. The distinction between a temporary servant and a permanent slave sharpened. Laws were enacted that made servitude for Africans a lifelong condition. A pivotal law in 1662 declared that a child's status free or enslaved would follow that of the mother. This was a radical departure from English common law and a deliberate move to create a hereditary system of slavery. It meant that the children of enslaved women would automatically become the property of the mother-s owner, creating a self-perpetuating and highly profitable labor force. Other laws followed, stripping Africans of the right to own property, bear arms, or testify against a white person in court. By the end of the 17th century, the ambiguous status of those first 20 and odd new arrivals had been brutally clarified. The system of indentured servitude for Africans had transformed into the rigid, race-based institution of chattel slavery. The shadows that fell upon Point Comfort in 1619 had lengthened into a total eclipse of freedom for millions of people and their descendants. The economic prosperity of Virginia and other colonies became inextricably linked to the exploitation of enslaved human beings. The ideals of freedom and liberty that were being debated in the colonial assemblies were built upon a foundation of profound and violent unfreedom. The arrival of those first Africans was not the beginning of a melting pot, but the start of a deep and painful paradox in the American story. It was the moment when the pursuit of wealth and power led a society down a dark road, creating a system of racial hierarchy and oppression whose consequences we are still grappling with today. Understanding 1619 is not about assigning blame. It's about acknowledging the full, complex, and often painful truth of our shared past. It is about recognizing that the story of America is one of both incredible ideals and terrible contradictions, and we must confront both to understand who we are as a nation. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into a pivotal moment in history. It's a heavy topic, but an essential one to understand. If you found this video informative, please give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel for more explorations of our past. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through history. In our last episode, we left Pocahontas in England, a celebrated figure, a symbol of hope for a peaceful future between two vastly different worlds. But as we open chapter 19, that hope begins to tragically unravel. The story takes a somber turn, reminding us that history is often written not just in ink, but in tears and conflict. In 1617, as Pocahontas, her husband, John Rolfe, and their young son Thomas prepared to sail back to Virginia, a shadow fell over their plans. Pocahontas fell gravely ill. The exact cause remains debated by historians. Some suggest pneumonia, others tuberculosis, or perhaps even smallpox. Regardless of the ailment, the vibrant young woman who had crossed an ocean was fading. She was only about 21 years old. According to Rolfe, her final words were a comfort to him, expressing her contentment that their son would live on, a living bridge between her people and his. She died in the town of Gravesend, England, and was buried there, thousands of miles from the forests and rivers of her homeland. Her journey, which had been a whirlwind of diplomacy, curiosity, and adaptation, came to an abrupt and heartbreaking end. The news of her death traveled slowly across the Atlantic, but its impact would be profound. In England, she was mourned as a symbol of successful cultural conversion, the civilized savage. But in Virginia, her passing created a vacuum. She had been a crucial link, a negotiator, a voice of reason. Her father, the great Chief Powhatan, was already old and had ceded much of his authority. Upon hearing of his favorite daughter's death, his spirit was broken. He died within a year. In the spring of 1618, with the two most powerful advocates for peace, Pocahontas and Powhatan. The fragile understanding between the colonists and the Powhatan Confederacy began to crumble. Powhatan was succeeded by his brother, Opetanquino. Unlike his brother, Opetanquino was not a diplomat. He was a warrior who had watched the English presence grow with increasing alarm. He had seen the colonists' insatiable hunger for land, particularly for tobacco cultivation, which was exhausting the soil and pushing the settlements ever deeper into native territory. The peace of Pocahontas had been built on personal relationships and a delicate balance of power. Now, that foundation was gone. Opetanquino saw the English not as partners, but as an existential threat to his people's way of life, their culture, and their very existence. He began to quietly and patiently plan. For several years, a tense and deceptive calm settled over the region. The colonists, focused on the booming tobacco trade, grew complacent. They expanded their plantations, built homes further and further apart, and believed the period of conflict was behind them. They misinterpreted the lack of open hostility as acceptance. But beneath the surface, Opetanquino was uniting the tribes, gathering warriors, and waiting for the right moment to strike. He believed that the only way to save his people was to eliminate the English threat completely. That moment came on the morning of March 22nd, 1622. In a meticulously coordinated attack, Powhatan warriors descended upon the English settlements scattered along the James River. They had entered the plantations under the guise of trade, some even sitting down for breakfast with the very families they were about to attack. The surprise was total, and the violence devastating. In a matter of hours, an estimated 347 colonists were killed, men, women, and children. This represented nearly a quarter of the entire English population in Virginia. The dream of a new Eden was shattered, replaced by a nightmare of fire and bloodshed. The event would become known to the English as the Indian Massacre of 1622. The attack was a strategic success for Opetanquino, but it ultimately failed to drive the English out. Instead, it hardened their resolve and extinguished any remaining widespread sentiment for a peaceful coexistence. The Virginia Company in London and the colonists on the ground now viewed the natives not as potential partners, but as treacherous enemies to be subdued or exterminated. The English response was swift and brutal. They abandoned their more vulnerable, outlying settlements and consolidated their forces around Jamestown. Then, they launched a series of relentless retaliatory raids. What followed was a decade of vicious, near-constant warfare. This was not a war of pitched battles, but one of attrition. The English waged a campaign of total war, targeting not just warriors, but entire villages, food supplies, and crops. Their strategy was to destroy the Powhatan people's ability to sustain themselves. They burned cornfields in the summer, raided food stores in the winter, and destroyed fishing weirs. The goal, as one colonist bluntly put it, was to root them out from being any longer a people. The Powhatan, in turn, continued their own raids, making life outside the fortified settlements perilous. The cycle of violence spiraled, fueled by fear, grief, and a desire for revenge on both sides. The conflict fundamentally reshaped the colony. The Virginia Company, already struggling financially, was crippled by the war. In 1624, King James I revoked its charter and Virginia became a royal colony, under the direct control of the English crown. This change brought more military resources and a more organized approach to both governance and warfare. The war also solidified a racialized worldview among the colonists. The distinction between civilized and savage became a chasm, used to justify the dispossession of native lands and the violence enacted against native peoples. Any hope of integration or mutual respect had evaporated in the smoke of burning villages. By the early 1630s, the Powhatan Confederacy was severely weakened. Years of war, disease, and starvation had taken a devastating toll. A formal truce was eventually reached in 1632, but it was a peace born of exhaustion, not reconciliation. The English had secured their hold on the land, and the Powhatan were forced to cede vast territories. A line had been drawn, both on the map and in the minds of the people. The dream of Pocahontas, a world where two cultures could live side by side, had died with her in England. In its place was a landscape of fear, mistrust, and a legacy of conflict that would define the relationship between European settlers and Native Americans for centuries to come. The tragedy of 1622 was not just the loss of life. It was the loss of a possible future. Thank you so much for joining me for this difficult but crucial chapter in our story. The events are somber, but understanding them is essential to understanding the complex history that followed. If you found this video insightful, please give it a like, and do you not forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next episode. We appreciate your support more than you know. See you next time. Hey everyone, welcome back to our historical deep dive series. Today, we're journeying back to the very beginning of English America, to a place of struggle, survival, and ultimate triumph. Jamestown. We've walked through its early days, the starving times, the conflicts, and the glimmers of hope. But now, in our final chapter, we ask the biggest question of all. What is Jamestown as a true legacy? How did this fragile mesquite-infested settlement on the banks of the James River manage to not only survive, but also lay the groundwork for what would become the United States of America? It's a story that's almost hard to believe. Think about it. Jamestown was a pressure cooker of disaster. Disease, starvation, and fierce conflicts with the Powhatan Confederacy nearly wiped it out multiple times. Remember the starving time of 1609. The colonists were reduced to eating leather and, in the most desperate cases, each other. It was a nightmare. When Lord Delaware arrived in 1610, he found the survivors ready to abandon the whole project. It was that close to being a complete failure, a forgotten footnote in history. So, how did it endure? The answer isn't simple. It's a mix of sheer human grit, a bit of luck, and one game-changing crop. Tobacco. John Rolfe's introduction of a sweeter, more marketable strain of tobacco turned Virginia from a money pit into a cash cow for the Virginia Company. Suddenly, there was a real economic reason to stay, to invest, and to expand. Tobacco was the engine that powered Jamestown's survival and growth. It created a demand for land and, tragically, a demand for labor that would have profound and lasting consequences. This economic foundation led to another crucial development: the establishment of the House of Burgesses in 1619. This was the first representative legislative assembly in the English colonies. For the first time, colonists had a say in their own governance, making laws and levying taxes. This was a radical idea. It planted the seed of self-government that would blossom over the next 150 years, eventually leading to the cry of no taxation without representation in the American Revolution. Jamestown wasn't just a place to make money. It became a laboratory for democracy. But we can't talk about Jamestown's legacy without acknowledging its darkest side. That same pivotal year, 1619, also saw the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in English North America. The insatiable demand for labor to work the tobacco fields fueled the growth of chattel slavery. This peculiar institution became deeply embedded in the social and economic fabric of the colony and, later, the nation. So, as Jamestown was laying the foundation for liberty and self-governance, it was simultaneously laying the foundation for centuries of bondage and systemic inequality. This is the great paradox of Jamestown, and indeed, of American history, the simultaneous birth of freedom and slavery. Jamestown also set the pattern for English relations with Native Americans. The initial interactions, a mix of cautious trade and outright hostility, eventually escalated into a long-term conflict over land. As the colony grew, the English hunger for more tobacco fields pushed the Powhatan people further and further from their ancestral homes. The treaties made were often broken, and the cycles of violence led to the displacement and decimation of indigenous populations. This pattern of expansion and conflict would be repeated time and time again as the frontier moved westward. So when we look back at Jamestown, we see a complex and messy inheritance. It's a story of incredible resilience. It's the story of the birth of American capitalism, driven by the lucrative tobacco trade. It's the birthplace of American democracy, with the House of Burgesses as a blueprint for a future government. But it is also the origin point of the deep-seated racial injustices that continue to challenge the nation today. And it is the beginning of a long and painful history of conflict with the continent. Origin inhabitants, Jamestown teaches us that history is never black and white. It's a tapestry woven with threads of triumph and tragedy, of liberty and oppression. The settlers of Jamestown weren't perfect heroes. They were flawed, desperate people, trying to survive in a harsh new world. Their choices, both good and bad, had consequences that rippled through centuries and continue to shape the world we live in. By understanding Jamestown, we understand the DNA of America. We see the roots of our political institutions, our economic systems, and our most enduring social struggles. It's the prologue to the American story, a story of a constant struggle to live up to the ideals of freedom and opportunity, even as its foundations were built on conflict and exploitation. It's a legacy that is both inspiring and challenging, and it's one we must continue to study and learn from. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the history of Jamestown. It's been an incredible story to tell. If you've enjoyed this series and want to see more historical deep dives, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. Let me know in the comments what part of Jamestown's legacy you find most fascinating. Until next time, stay curious.